Just like with teaching, social work, and journalism, you don't usually decide to start working in politics for the money. But a recent poll of staffers on Beacon Hill found that many are leaving because of it. Nearly 90% of legislative staff said they don't feel like they're paid fairly for the hours they work and the amount of responsibility they take on, according to the poll, which was conducted by Beacon BLOC, a coalition of Black State House staffers and allies. For many, the pay is so low they're not able to afford basic necessities, with nearly 1 in 6 saying they've experienced food insecurity while working on Beacon Hill. And nearly half said they're not able to support themselves and their dependents on their current salary. And then there are the working conditions. As one person described them, as staffers, we take on many roles and responsibilities that we're not necessarily compensated for. This includes working long nights, not having time for a lunch break, working on weekends, etc. We often have to take on the role of a social worker in our dealings with constituents, which can be arduous and draining, especially given the higher caseloads due to the pandemic. Unsurprisingly, all of it can make it hard to stay in the job. According to Beacon BLOC, people also described concerns about turnover and losing coworkers with great potential and skill sets. The poll was just the latest in a series of efforts from the group to raise awareness about the low pay and difficult working conditions at the State House. And last week, they seem to have made some headway, winning 6% raises and $500 stipends for all State House and Senate employees. But Beacon BLOC says that's not enough. I'm joined now by two members of the group, both former Beacon Hill staffers, Kyéra Sterling and Nicole Eigbrett. Thank you both for being here. Let me ask you, as a pair at the outset, to the extent that you're comfortable, I'd love to hear what your experience working on the Hill was like in terms of the compensation that you received and how you lived as a result of that. And if you want to get into the other factors that we're talking about here, long hours, lack of training for some things that you're expected to, that'd be great too. So tell me what you can about what the experience was like for each of you.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to kick this off. I think it's important to note I'm a first-generation college student. I had come to the Hill, really excited to make a difference for, my family and for communities of color, and didn't have the same resources that a lot of other folks on the Hill that I met had. Right. So that meant being able to intern previously, having already experience on the Hill, and being able to have, family and people that supported them financially while they accrued that experience. I didn't have that. Right. I came in starting at around 42,000. I think I was 42,600 at the time. And I remember having to couch surf for about 3 to 4 months to be able to scrape up first class in security on my first apartment, which I still had, 3 roommates for, and I lived out in Roslindale. Those were experiences that felt really singular, and not like a lot of these ones that my other coworkers had and my colleagues had, right? And beyond that, that was just first class insecurity for an apartment, never mind rent and never mind trying to figure out what it meant to pay for food. And, there's a running sort of joke that's not quite funny about the amount of staffers that relied on events to take place in this giant Great Hall of Flags that's within the sort of the State House because of the free food and the amount of staff that would rely on those events during weeks where you were between paychecks and trying to figure out how to go to the grocery store and how to have dinner and how to feed yourself were really real.
Nicole, how about you?
Yeah, and so I was a legislative aide from 2017 to 2020 and kind of had 2 different experiences. So initially I was an aide in a committee chair's office for about 6 months. And so a lot of the work was kind of divvied up. But as a legislative aide, you are responsible in kind of a catch-all position. And then the second legislator I worked for, I was her single staffer. And, for single aides, it is a huge burden on them to be carrying an office, because not only are you the scheduler and secretary for your legislator, you're doing all the policy work and the constituent services and meeting the needs of the district, as well as meeting with advocates and lobbyists. And as Kyéra mentioned, working on weekends or after hours, especially if session was to run very late at night. So in a similar sense, I came into the State House also without previous political experience and found myself kind of thrown into a pool where there was no training and no resources. You really were just in the fire and having to figure it out on your own without that institutional support. And in terms of the compensation and the salary, I very quickly realized that I needed at least a second job to make ends meet so I could sufficiently pay my rent living again in Greater Boston. And so, within my first year, I got a second job in the service sector. So that meant that not only was I working 40 to 50 plus hours as a legislative aide, but then on the weekends working in the service industry and trying to accrue those tips to make ends meet. And it was quite frankly very exhausting.
Kyéra, let me go back to you for a second. You mentioned your background and the way that it didn't match up with some fellow staffers on Beacon Hill. I'm wondering if you saw in your time working at the State House, people whose families lacked resources falling away from working in the building and jobs being held over the longer run by people whose families might have been affluent or at least had enough money that they could carry them a little bit while they were struggling to make ends meet. Was that a dynamic at play?
Certainly a dynamic that often came up, whether that was, colleagues of mine that couldn't grab a coffee, a very regular, occurrence that is, you often do with your colleagues to work on a project to hash out some sort of details, but they couldn't because of, not having the resources that particular week, all the way down to the actual performance and work, right? Like so many of my colleagues of color feel like they cannot make mistakes because they can't afford to make mistakes, right? So the job that they're showing up to do is that much more important and feels that much more drastic and encumbers all of this level of heightened anxiety that a lot of perhaps other more affluent colleagues of ours don't have to face, right? So there's all of these dynamics that are not just specific to the paycheck that have all of these greater implications.
And tell me if I'm wrong here, Nicole. I think of the State House as, if you're working in a job like the ones you guys did, you're both supporting the work of someone who is a current lawmaker, but you're also part of this pool of people who are potentially moving on to bigger, more powerful, more influential positions in public life in Massachusetts. So correct me if I'm misguided here, but the dynamic that Kyéra is talking about, it seems to me like if you have people from certain backgrounds falling away because they just can't cope with the sort of hard financial realities of the job and the existential realities of the job, you're changing the group of people who are going to end up running Massachusetts in 10 or 20 or 30 years. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Adam, because for Beacon BLOC, our aim here is not to just improve pay and working conditions for individual staff. It's about improving our legislature and how it functions as a democracy in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It's about attracting and retaining talented, committed legislative staff and continuing that institutional knowledge that otherwise, could be lost. The State House definitely suffers from a brain drain when, again, staff who lack generational wealth or who are working parents or come from working class backgrounds are not able to stay in these roles. And it jeopardizes the legislature's ability to function to the extent that, some examples are like the quality of drafting that goes into our bills and the continuity of staff in the legislative process, because bills aren't typically passed in one session, right? It takes years of effort. And so what's troubling to me really is that staffers get caught up in this kind of political system and game. And in many ways, I saw my colleagues kind of embodied the spirit of public service better than legislators themselves. And this isn't because legislators are bad people. They're simply stuck in this game that leadership has created. a political game that forces legislators to play with sticks and carrots as incentives. Should a legislator expend their political capital to secure a raise for the legislative aide or to pass the bill for their district? And unfortunately, we as staff end up becoming pawns in this situation. And it's something that's so far beyond out of our control.
So if the House Speaker and the Senate President stumble on this segment, I mean, I'm sure that they're hearing from you guys in other ways. I don't want to overrepresent this, but if they came to you tomorrow or in a few days and said, all right, you two made some compelling arguments in that conversation. Beacon BLOC has made compelling arguments. What do we change? What are the big things that we change in the next year? What counsel would you give them? And Kyéra, let's start with you and then we'll go to Nicole.
Yeah, I think first off, we want to make sure that COLAs are standardized. There's no reason why we should not be giving staff cost of living adjustments on a regular basis in the same way that legislators do. Additionally, we're really glad to have seen the addition of the diversity talent pipeline and paid sort of internships for staff as part of the House and Senate budgets, but we want to make sure that gets instituted. We want to make investments and allow, financial backing for folks from communities that are disenfranchised and marginalized to have access to the building. So many folks of color that I work with, told me that the first time they had ever stepped foot in the State House was when they started working there. And some of them have grown up and been born and raised in Boston. And that's not the tone that we want to set for a legislature, right? A state legislature that makes laws for all of these communities.
Nicole, what would you suggest if the leaders came to you?
Yeah, in addition to what Kyéra just shared, I would like to see a culture within the State House transform that is simply not just about the political hierarchy, but that a culture that truly values staff and provides these types of basic human resource functions that you'd likely expect from any other employer. Because, ultimately, from my experience, I truly love this work. And, but after 6 months to my first year, I was exhausted and frustrated that it was a confluence of low pay, long hours, and a culture of silence. And, I witnessed friends being treated disrespectfully. And, I just feel like leadership should do more to transform that climate and not make that the standard for how things function.
Do you have a sense that they are taking the call that you are making collectively seriously? We mentioned this 6% pay raise that apparently is going to become reality, $500 stipends. Clearly, from everything that you've run through here, that alone isn't enough. But do you think they're hearing you?
I do think that we have an understanding that there is a lot of space for us to collaborate, and I definitely think the conversations are ongoing. I do think it's important to emphasize that staff are here to work with leadership, right? We're here to get things done. And I do hope that is something that those up at the top understand. We're not here to just to cause troubles that we don't have solutions for. We're here to be collaborative.
I got to mention before go ahead, Nicole. Hop in.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to mention again, too, that we're also here because we love the work, because each of us are truly dedicated public servants. And it was, for me personally, an incredibly difficult decision to decide to leave. I wanted to build a career in the State House, but no longer viewed it as feasible. And so in that spirit as well, would love to leadership to know that we're doing this because we want our legislature to be the best that it can be.
I got to mention as we wrap up, and I'd love to keep going with you guys for 15 more minutes, but I can't. I hadn't realized that is it a 2-month delay to get health insurance when you become a staffer, which I don't know how you work through something like that. That would be brutal. So another thing for people to ponder. Thank you both for being here, Nicole and Kyéra. I really appreciate this convo.
Thanks,
Thank you for
Adam.
having us.